Well, I know many of you were able to watch the video that was sent out of my testimony, but I will share again and maybe a few other details along the way. And I am not a Southerner, as you, if you haven't met me before, you can tell simply by the way that I talk. It took a while to understand Southern lingo myself when I moved to Georgia 18 years ago. When I first landed in Atlanta, I had never really had much interaction with people from the South, and I had to have someone who was with me do a little translation work for me. So over the years, I've learned a lot and have done well, and so now Pastor Jeff and I can have conversations without missing a beat. I grew up in Colorado, in Parker, Colorado, actually a smaller town called Franktown, on top of a hill, and out of our dining room window we saw Pikes Peak every morning. As a child, I didn't really appreciate that much, but I would love to go back and see that again. My parents from Iowa, good Midwestern family, moved there when I was very, very young, so that's all I really knew in my childhood. My dad was raised Roman Catholic. My mom raised in a very fundamentalist, independent Baptist home. And so you can imagine when they met each other, neither family was all that excited about their union, but they did marry, and as a result of those differences, they really had nothing to do with the church at all. And my dad was in the Army, went to Hawaii. They spent 4 excruciating years in peacetime in Hawaii as an officer. So he wasn't really in the Army, I tell him all the time. He was on vacation for 4 years. But they moved to Colorado. I have one older brother who was born just prior to them getting there. So I grew up in Colorado, and when I was a young child, my friends would invite me to church. I was just a little bit younger than my middle daughter. I was about 7, 8 years old, and I started going to a little Baptist church just down the road from our home. And we went to Awana on Wednesday nights. My parents would either drop me off or a friend's parents would come and pick me up, and I would go there and we would memorize verses from the King James, play some games, and then hear a little Bible lesson every Wednesday night. And I really, I don't have any specific time in mind of when that was, other than about that age range, around 7, 8, 9 years old, when I do believe that the Lord saved me through that, through going to Awana and spending time there with my friends and hearing the Bible taught during that. And I thank God for that I, even from a young age, not in a home that was attending church or hearing the regular preaching of the Word or talking about the Word of God at home, that the Lord still chose to save me during that time. But as a result of that, there was very little discipleship along the way. I'm again thankful for that church, but they really didn't have any thought about how they would take in a child, essentially, at that point and teach the Bible. And so a lot of it was me just sort of learning things along the way. And I've always been a reader, and I'm grateful for that. The Lord gave me that desire. And so it really wasn't until my teenage years I got involved in high school in Young Life International. And during that time, I met a lot of faithful believers, and they were from all sorts of different kinds of churches and had a lot of different ideas. If you're familiar with Young Life at all, it's quite a mix of people, and so as a result, they're fairly light on doctrine, but certainly at the time anyway, I don't know how things are now, we're faithful to teach the gospel and to reach out and to disciple young people that were in situations just like mine. They had either had no interaction with the church or the scriptures, or they had a little, or they were believers from non-Christian homes. And so I'm very thankful for that time as well, being able to grow up into that and to meet some faithful people. It just so happened at the time, however, that the director of that, where I was living at the time, was Eastern Orthodox, and so I was introduced to the Eastern Orthodox Church. Spent some time there, smelling all the incense and looking at all the icons and asking a lot of questions about what all of this meant, and so that sort of began a bit of a journey for me, trying to figure out exactly what I believed. When I was in high school, between my sophomore and junior year of high school, I guess I've been 15, 16 years old, my family relocated. We moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico. If you've never been there, you're not missing much. We lived in Santa Fe. I went to school in Los Alamos, New Mexico. And if you know your American history, Los Alamos is where the atomic bomb was created during the Manhattan Project. And that's because my father has always worked in the nuclear weapons industry, and just retired a couple of years ago and opened an ice cream shop in Tennessee. So a little bit of a difference. So I regret many interactions I had with my family during those years. Obviously, it's difficult to make a transition when you're a teenager, but in my young pride and arrogance, assumed that my parents were doing me wrong, and that I should be allowed. I even talked to my friends' parents to see if I could stay with them and finish high school where I lived, and had every argument I could possibly come up with. And in their wisdom, they brought me along, and I was not kind to them, very unfortunate. And several years later, was able to come back to them and to acknowledge that, and to apologize to my parents because of that. But it was a tough time. It was a tough transition. I've certainly had that in mind as we've considered coming here with my own children. But so in New Mexico was when I could finally drive, and I was able each Lord's Day to go to a different church, and I would drive around town and find churches, and I would just go. This was, imagine this, before the time the internet was really much of a thing. And so I just drove around and found churches and would go there one Sunday. Often would find opportunities to meet with a pastor or a priest or a rector or whoever it was, and to begin to ask questions and see what everyone believed and why they did the things that they did. And at the time was also reading a lot. I would go to Borders bookstore, and I would go to the Christian section and just saw all these books and wanted to read as much as I could. And I happened across a book called Desiring God by John Piper, and the title intrigued me, the subtitle really, Meditations of a Christian Hedonist. And so I started reading that and noticed he was quoting Jonathan Edwards, who I knew from my literature classes in school. I saw C.S. Lewis, who I was familiar with, and so I started reading more of those guys, and came to understand God to be much bigger and much more powerful than I had really ever thought of him to be. And my understanding of God's sovereignty in all things really developed during that time, and I never struggled really with understanding Reformed theology specifically. It just made sense to me as I was reading, and I thank God that these were the things I was reading, but it just made sense. A lot of people come into Reformed theology and talk about the struggle of trying to grasp that and to deal with other things they've understood or learned along the way. And I'm thankful. I'm thankful that when I was 17 years old or so that I really came to grips with that. And then, as a result, had a lot more questions. Well, why are certain churches doing certain things? And so I continued to ask questions, continued to seek out where the Lord wanted me to be, and where I could learn and where I could grow, and in time continued to be really intrigued by understanding what Eastern Orthodoxy was and why they were doing all of the things that were so different from everyone else, and in time really realized that not only was that not where I needed to be, I saw some very fundamental problems with regard to what I was learning and understanding from the scriptures themselves. And so was able to move on from that and visit a few other places for a while. Never really settled into any church, but just spent some time wandering about, and still at that point involved in young life, but really never had anyone to call me to settle down, to be baptized, and to get involved in a local church. And so when I graduated from high school in the year 2000, I know it doesn't seem that long ago, but that was 21, almost 22 years ago, I went to college at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. That was hence the sweater that Chuck had on Wednesday night. My wife is a Lobo, a graduate of the University of New Mexico. I went there to study political science, and while I was there, I was working full-time for an attorney as a legal assistant, doing Social Security, disability law, thinking I wanted to go to law school eventually, and it was all very interesting, but I was neglecting my studies greatly, because I was 18, 19 years old, making a lot of money for an 18, 19-year-old, and sitting in class when I could be working really wasn't all that appealing to me. So I got by. I had in mind, my mindset was C's get degrees, and so I did my best to get C's to get my degree, but that doesn't last very long, and that's not a great motto for success. Also during that time, still trying to find my way with regard to where I was going to be in church and what I was going to do in terms of my faith. And again, visiting around different places in college, all of the Christians were going to these large churches in the area, so I would go, and was really not taken by sort of the more entertainment. This was early 2000s, so the seeker-sensitive churches were very popular at the time, and that really never appealed to me. I went to some smaller Baptist and Presbyterian churches a little bit off and on, and liked those, but still just really confused about my life at that time, and not really sure what to do. And so after about a year and a half of that, I finally had a very large and not powerful computer in my apartment, and was able to at least dial in on the internet, and had a crazy thought that I would see what was out there that I could do other than what I was doing at the time. And so I had heard on a commercial, a GoArmy.com commercial, that they would pay for your school and you could see the world. And so I just requested some information that thought they might mail it to me. And the next day there was a recruiter at the door of my apartment. So I was 19 at the time, and the recruiter showed up, and we talked for a while. He had me run through a test to see what I would qualify for, and he said, you can pick whatever job you want in the Army. You can go to airborne school. You can do all of these things. And so I talked to my parents. You can imagine they were not so excited. This was pretty much immediately after 9/11 had happened. And so a week later, I was signing my contract to finish my final semester of college at UNM and to join the Army. So I signed on the line and had a few more months to go. And along the way, just in God's providence, I stopped one day while I was walking through the corridor to talk to a friend, and he was talking to a friend, and we said hi, and that was that, and I think we took notice of each other. And then the next day, that same friend had invited me to go bowling because he knew I was leaving for the Army soon. We hadn't hung out in a while, and I showed up at the bowling alley, and he was there with a group of friends, and about 30 minutes late, right on time for her, Felicia showed up. And because there were so many people, she had to bowl in another lane than us, and so I decided I wanted to go and talk to her, so I switched lanes, and we talked pretty much all night, and she told me she was studying biology and chemistry, and she was pre-med, and so I was ready to get married right then and there. But we talked for a while, and so I had about 2 months before I left, and we talked every day and hung out a lot, and she met my parents, and even after I had left, she would go on the weekends and spend the weekends with my parents. She did her laundry and her homework, and my dad brought her to get pizza and ice cream, and they became the best of friends. So we said we'll keep in touch and see how it goes. And in 2002, I was gone. I left to go to basic training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and then from there down to Arizona, Fort Huachuca, Arizona. Spent 6 months down there. From there to Fort Benning to go to airborne school and to the Ranger Indoctrination Program. And all along the way, keeping in touch. And through that time, going to chapel services and meeting other Christians and talking to them about where they were from and what they believed and how they came to believe those things and why they understood things the way that they did. And, you know, I think back on that, and I am grateful for many of the chaplains I had in the military, but I'm also saddened by the state of the chaplaincy in the military. There are some very good, very faithful chaplains in the military, but there are many that are not, and it's unfortunate that this is how things are. And for many of those men, the only encounters they have with the Scriptures is when they come into the Army and they have a chaplain there. And many of them are not evangelistic in the least bit. They're there to sort of do what they're asked to do and never go out of their way to do much more. And so that's very unfortunate, but I'm grateful I had many who were very good and very faithful and still considered friends today. So, so when I was finally stationed in Savannah in 2003, I arrived, and my first order of business that I wanted to take care of was to find a church. But I got there. I was in 1st Ranger Battalion of the 75th Ranger Regiment, and I got there and they said, in 6 days we are leaving. We're getting deployed for the start of the war in Iraq, and you just need to call your family and let them know they won't hear from you for a while, and we're going to take off. So I was never even there for a Sunday. I wasn't even there a full week to be able to find a church, and was on a plane to to Saudi Arabia to begin the Iraq War. But it was there. And again, I mentioned the chaplaincy. I'm very, very grateful for my friend still in the Army. He's a colonel now. He's a chaplain. Dave Bullis is his name. And Dave and I talked early on about the Lord, and he really took me under his wing and taught me a lot and helped me to stay grounded and to think deeply about the Scriptures. And we prayed a lot together, and we read a lot together. And war is not always action. There's a lot of downtime, and so we had a lot of downtime to talk about the things of God. And it was very encouraging to meet other men as well who were faithful. Trying to keep in touch along the way with with Felicia and my parents, and to keep a connection back home. But really, at that time, there wasn't much, and so sort of out there in the middle of the desert on our own, trying to figure out life. And it's a very different environment, but I am thankful for it. As I look back, I'm very grateful for what the Lord did through that time on my very first deployment. So I was there for 47 days, no showers. Got to Kuwait, took my first shower, and then flew back home and called everyone and said I'm home. And that very next Sunday, I found a church just down the road from where I was stationed called Ardsley Park Baptist Church. And I got there, and there was an older pastor there. He had 3 sons. 2 of them were also pastors. A small Southern Baptist church. The average age of the members there, I think, was 76 or so, somewhere in there. So you can imagine an older congregation, advanced in years, as the Bible would say. They see a young soldier coming into their church. They were very welcoming and very grateful to see me, and they took me right in. And that first Sunday, I had multiple invitations to go over for lunch, and so I took one of those and became very good friends with one of the deacons and his wife. Their kids were older than me, and they treated me like one of their own. So it was my first experience with a true Southern meal, a little bit of meat and about 50 side dishes, and I really enjoyed that. And so spent time with them, getting to know them and talking to them about the Lord. But the pastor there, he took me in as well, and we spent a lot of time together. And it was during that time where I started to develop an interest in talking to other people about the Scriptures and praying with others. And so I taught a Sunday school class here or there, and in the midst of that was getting deployed again to other places, Afghanistan, back to Iraq, going to school, going off to Ranger School. And so I was all over the place. But every time I was home, we would meet together on a regular basis and study the Bible. He'd take me on visitations with him to visit some, there were many who were shut-ins in their homes. And so we would go visit them. We'd go to the nursing home together. And I think the Lord really used that to develop in me a desire for ministry. And I guess, a part of that, too, was he had discovered during that time that, yes, I believe I was a Christian for quite a while at that point, but I'd never been baptized because I never committed to any local church yet. And so I was baptized there as a young ranger, 20 years old. I was baptized and very grateful for that. And really from there, at that point, was when my love for Christ, my love for His church really took off. And I wanted to be at church as much as I could. I wanted to study as much as I could. And I would go on these deployments. I didn't have Logos Bible software at the time. I didn't have electronic means. And so I got to bring one large box, and I filled it with books. And I would get deployed with all of these books and drag them around with me everywhere I went so I could read and study. And again, spending a lot of time praying. And it was very clear to me when I was in Afghanistan, just prior to getting married, that the Lord wanted me to pursue ministry. And I will always remember a night I was with my chaplain at the time. We were sitting on the roof of a building looking at this vast expanse above us. There's no lights to drown out the stars. It was beautiful. And I just turned to him and I said, I think I want to preach the gospel. And he encouraged me in that and said, well, you need to keep praying, and I'll be praying with you. And when you get home, talk to your pastor about that. And so I did. But before I did that, I called Felicia and said, I know we're getting married in about 2 weeks when I get home, but I think I want to be a pastor. And I always tell young men, especially if you're about to get married, 2 weeks out from that wedding is not the best time to tell her I'm about to do something far outside of anything you imagine we would do. And she was very gracious and received that very well and said, okay, well, whatever the Lord wants, we'll see how it goes. And so I got back, talked to my pastor. We got married in 2004 in New Mexico. And I had a couple weeks at home, went back to Savannah, and she was finishing school. And so our first 2 years of marriage, I'll just say we had about 6 months combined together. Between her being in school and me getting deployed and just really not being able to spend a lot of time together. But I started back to school. I was in the Army at the Baptist College of Florida studying biblical studies there online, distance education. It was one of the first distance education programs in the country, and was able to continue doing that while I was out and about around the world. And Felicia finally moved to Savannah, and as soon as she got there, we had about a month together. 2 months? 2 weeks. Okay, we had 2 weeks together, and I was deployed, and here she is, a young, newlywed in a new place on the other side of the country from any of her family or anything, trying to figure out what to do with her life. And so she was finishing out a few other classes before she could apply to physician assistant school. So it was a difficult couple of years, to say the least. But the Lord kept us together, and that same church really took her in as well and treated her well and cared for her while I was gone. And such a blessing to us that those people were there to do that. So yeah, married in 2004. I had 2 years left in the Army. It was pretty much the same thing over and over again, going back and forth. I was deployed 3 times to Iraq, 3 times to Afghanistan, and had schools in between and training missions in between. So I was never really home, but still doing school, and got out of the Army in 2006. And my hope was to go into ministry from there. And so talking to my pastor, looked around the area because we needed to stay there. Felicia was in PA school, and found a local church, small Southern Baptist church just outside of the downtown, who was hiring someone for an associate pastor. And I talked to them, and they reluctantly hired me. I was 24 at the time, far too young. Far too eager and arrogant and prideful, and right out of the Army, a lot of testosterone, a lot of everything that doesn't exhibit the characteristics of a meek and mild pastor. So we got there and realized very quickly that I think back on it now, when they talked to me, they didn't ask me a single question about my doctrine or what I believed from the scriptures. They just took the word of my pastor at the time for all of it and hired me. And so we were there for exactly 1 year to the day before I realized we had to go. There are some funny stories from all of that, but we can just say it was not a good fit on both ends. I learned a lot. I'm thankful for that experience in a lot of ways. I would do things very differently today. Obviously, I wouldn't have gone there in the first place, but the Lord used that and taught us a lot, and what we wanted and were looking for in a church, what I was looking for in ministry, and how to interact with people on a different level. Sometimes it's a struggle for guys getting out of the military. How do you go into the real world, I should say? And beyond that, how do you leave the military environment and go into ministry? I never understood at the time. A lot of older pastors said, you've been shot at many times. You'll be used to this, ready for being a pastor in the church. I didn't know what they meant. I learned very quickly. There's a lot of comparisons to be made. It was as a result of going and being invited by a friend to preach at a weekend conference for his church. just a little bit further outside of town. And it was there they came to me and asked if I would consider coming to be a pastor at their church, which was at the time called Ephesus Church. And so I went, did the conference, talked to them, and eventually came back and talked to Felicia about all of it, and she was more than eager to move on as well. So we transitioned, and I went out to Rincon, Georgia, just outside of Savannah, and took on the role as one of the pastors at Ephesus Church. Now they were, before we ever got there, they were a progressive primitive Baptist church. Now, to this day, I can tell you a little bit about what that means, but I don't really know. They had left all of that behind. They had adopted the 1689 as their confession of faith, at least in theory. And we got there and realized very quickly that there was much about the church that was not what we began to understand about the confession and about Reformed theology, and still very young. Still too young for such a role, I can admit now. Went to work trying to make a lot of changes to be conformed more to our confession. Now, some of those things needed to happen right away, some of them probably not so quickly. And so we got to work. I had several elders there. There were 5 of us at the time, and 3 of them were very eager to do these things. They had wanted to for a while and learned very quickly. There was a lot of strife and contention that had been going on there for years. And so we're fairly newly married. We're just learning how to live together after about a year of a difficult situation, coming into our second church where there is already a lot of disunity and problems. And so our first couple of years of ministry were not all that encouraging, and learned this is not going to be the easiest road ahead. And after about a year and a half, the 2 of the men who were elders there, they decided to leave, and they took about half the church with them and went across the street and started something else that they said was not adamantly not going to be confessional. We're not going to have plurality of elders, and on down the road there was a lot. We kind of knew things were going to be okay when one Sunday they had a big sign that said that they were going to have Funapalooza next Sunday night, and it was a big banner in front of the church. So we realized we sort of dodged a bullet there, and so it was really a start over, kind of a replanting of the church, and the Lord was very kind to us, very gracious. Very faithful people were there. They wanted to hear the Word of God preached. They wanted to have biblical worship. They wanted to meet and study the Scriptures. And so slowly but surely we kept plodding along. And over time, Redeemer began... Ephesus at the time began to continue to grow faithfully, and the vast majority of the church at that point, and I would say even still, was first-generation Christians, people who were coming to know the Lord for the first time. They weren't raised in the church. Many of them from other parts of the country, which is very unique in South Georgia, that you would find a church full of people not from there. And we started to study the Bible together, learning how to be parents for the first time, all of us together, and learning how to relate to one another in the church for the first time, and a very exciting place to do ministry for a lot of those reasons, and so we changed over time. The bylaws were rewritten. The Constitution was rewritten. The church was renamed. That was my final hoorah. I had to do that. I did not like the name of the church. No one could pronounce it if they didn't know the Bible. And if they did know the Bible, I had to say it's Ephesus, like in the book of Ephesians, not the book of Revelation. Yeah. So we were ready. We were ready to make these changes, and the church was so supportive and encouraging along the way. And so we've been doing that work for 14 years, and along the way we had our 3 children. Our oldest, Eva, was born in 2009. Our middle child, Avery, she was born in 2011. And then Nicholas Jr. was born in 2015. And so that's the only church they've ever known and been a part of. That's the only community they've ever been at. That's the only home they've ever lived in. And so it is a place that we love amongst the people that we love and care very much for. And we've been through a lot with them, but we're grateful that the Lord has gotten us to this point, and we're ready to give the high five and hand it off. So that's some of the details of my life going along. I guess I missed in there at some point. I went to seminary, and that was while doing ministry. Obviously, I was taking classes, and I would actually come down here for classes in Fort Lauderdale at Knox. I would come for a week at a time and do some classes, some modules. The rest was online. So I graduated from Knox. What year was that? 2015. Yes, actually, they couldn't come to my graduation because my son was just born. And then shortly after that began my work on my PhD at Faulkner University in Alabama. I've never been there. I don't know what the campus looks like, but all of that has been distance, and I'm, Lord willing, going to finish that very soon, working on my dissertation now. So my study in that has been focused on primarily, well, my studies is in general humanities and the great books of the Western world. So if you're not familiar with that, there's 54 volumes compiled by Mortimer Adler of the greatest works of history that have developed Western civilization. And from that, I had a growing interest in the influence of postmodernism on our culture and the church, and then began to understand more about critical theory, and then beginning to see a combination of the two and how they have worked together to bring us to the point we are in Western civilization today. And so my focus in my dissertation is on the combination of those two things, critical theory and postmodernism, and the influence on the West, and particularly the introduction of and the embrace of Marxism in our culture, not just economically and politically, but socially and culturally, and what influence that has had, not just on society, but specifically on the church. And so that's where I've focused my attention. Many of you have heard some of those lectures from RBS, and Lord willing, in time, I'll have something that you can read about that maybe one day. So looking forward to getting all of that done. But so yeah, that's us. My wife and I have been married 17 years, 18 in July. I'll be 40 in April. My oldest is 12. Eva is 12. Avery will be 10 in a few weeks. And Nicholas is 6 and full of energy from top to bottom. So they all look forward to getting to know you and us as well. And we're very, like I said, we're very, very thankful for your kindness, your hospitality, for your love, and for your prayers. And we are very much looking forward to calling this our new home in a few months, Lord willing. So I guess we're right on time. So I will pray. All right. Father, thank you so much for this time, for your kindness, for your grace, for your mercy. Lord, it's always amazing to recount our lives and what you have done in our lives, and my story is no different than anyone else's in that I am where I am today by your grace alone. And so I thank you for every opportunity we have to share about how you work in our lives and how you have committed all of us in our hearts and our minds and our lives to look to Christ, that we might find true life, that we might walk in obedience and faithfulness, that we might have a love for the church and for the brethren. Lord, I'm so grateful that in so many places we can go in this world, that we can meet our brothers and sisters, that we can go to other countries and other states and cities and be amongst those who love Christ, that we will live and dwell with for eternity. I'm especially thankful, though, Lord, that we have local churches, that we have local expressions of the church, that as we gather together, we can get to know each other very well and to have loving relationships with one another, to call our true family, and to delight in serving one another and bearing one another's burdens and weeping with each other and rejoicing with each other. And so, Lord, I am thankful for the faithfulness and for the many years of looking to Christ at Redeemer Baptist Church. I'm grateful and looking forward to many years forward together with Emmanuel Baptist Church. And Lord, I'm thankful that there is a unity of kindred spirits and like mind and like faith amongst our churches. And I pray that that continues, that your churches are protected and guarded and watched over, that many more people, hundreds of thousands of people, could stand here and share their story of how you came to love and call them to yourself, and how they came to know you and trust you and love you with all of their life. And so we thank you for every testimony of your grace. We thank you for every opportunity to gather with your people. And we pray now, as we prepare ourselves to enter into a time of corporate worship, that you would help us to set aside all of our earthly cares, that we would be able to focus our hearts and our minds upon your word, that we would be able to worship in spirit and in truth, that we would be guarded against fatigue and weariness from this world, and that as we get a foretaste of what it will be to dwell with all of our brethren from every tongue, tribe, people, and nation, as we gather in this church this morning, will you meet with us? Will you teach us? Will you give us bigger, more faithful hearts for Christ? And we ask that you do all of this in the powerful and precious name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ.